Yeah, thank you very much, everyone, for coming. And I just wanted to say it's my honor to invite Professor Zaheer here for our Grand Rounds talk this morning. Um, Professor Zaheer is really kind of known to everyone in the business community. He received his PhD at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He has been at the Carlson School for over 30 years. Now he's the chair of strategic management and entrepreneurship, and he's a prolific researcher and teacher. He has won many teaching awards. He's been named one of the best teachers in the world by poets and quants, one of the best professors in the world by
Includes
poets and quants. Yes,
research.
and a prolific researcher who has collaborated with cardiologists in the past and published with cardiologists. So, without further ado, it is my tremendous honor to have Professor Zahir here, and thank you for coming.
Thank you. Thank you, Suhan. Suhi. Okay, so it's a wonderful pleasure to be here. Let me give you a little bit of a background about where I come from. I was born in India, where I spent the first 20 odd years of my life doing something I regret, which is a degree in economics. So, economists have a bad reputation for, get a bad rap, not unjustifiably, right? I then did an MBA where I met my now wife. And as it turns out, I met her on the stage because I was a semi-professional actor. I played Macbeth in Macbeth. I traveled with a British troupe. And I seriously considered doing theater as a profession. But then I realized that the returns were uncertain. So I did an MBA. And here I am. My wife and I both did our PhDs, as Dr. Wan says, at MIT. And when we finished, we had offers from several places like the University of Michigan and the University of Pennsylvania. But the University of Minnesota made both of us offers, and we had two small children, so we came here. And in that time, my wife has done a lot better than I have because she was dean of the school, of the Carlson School, which made her my boss's boss's boss. And of course, she's my boss at home as well. So that made her my boss 4 times over. Now she's stopped being dean, so she's just my boss. I've had the pleasure of having Dr. Wan in my class, one of the best students. Thank you for being in my class. And I'm going to talk about something that's very close to my heart, which is trust. And we are talking trust in a business setting, in a professional setting. We are not talking trust between family members. We're talking trust between colleagues. We're talking trust across business units. And I'm just going to give you a hint of where I'm going to go. So I've got a lot of material, and I'm going to rush through some slides, and I may not even be able to get to all the slides. But I've had a little bit of a background of the Minnesota Heart Institute Foundation and the way it's organized. So I'm going to try and tailor my talk a little bit to the setting. So I'm going to talk about creating, fostering a culture of collaboration and trust. Because collaboration involves trust. And I've done work as well on culture. So why the material is a little extensive is because I'm going to talk about 2 big things, which are culture and trust. But the biggest part is going to be trust. All right. So with that, I'm just going to start by giving you a sense of the agenda. So as I said, I'm going to talk about culture because, again, the idea is to foster a culture of collaboration and trust, because you need trust. Trust is a foundation of collaboration. You cannot have collaboration without trust. But then, what is culture? And so we want to get a sense of what culture is, want to get a sense of what it means to change the culture, which is very hard, right? Tell you that right up front. But then the most meaty part of the talk is going to be about creating trust between individuals and between organizational units. And I've done, well, I've been lucky enough to have 70 or 80 papers, which is not a lot in your field, but it's a sizable amount in our field, and some of them quite widely cited. So again, starting with culture, what are the elements of culture? Are there subcultures? And of course, as I understand it, a real issue with the setting that you're in is that there are subcultures because you have integrated different pieces of the system, and they, of course, all bring their subcultures with them. The complexity of culture, because we are all part of very different cultures, even though we may be all cardiologists or working in the health system, we still are parts of different cultures. And how do we deal with that in terms of changing culture, say, or introducing trust into the culture? How do you change the culture, as I said? And then we move to research. So I'm going to talk about my research on trust. What does it mean to trust in a business context? Again, this is not trusting your family member, your child, your parent, your sibling. Why is it important in business contexts? How does it evolve? What are different kinds of different kinds of trust? The notion of trustworthiness, which is not the same as trust, but very closely related. And then much more specifically, and I've done work, I have a paper on this, which is actually quite well cited. It has, I don't know if cites mean anything for you folks, but it has some 7,000 Google Scholar citations. And then how do we go about creating a culture of trust, fostering a culture of collaboration based on trust, right? So that's, the meat of the story. And I hope to be able to spend some time on it. So I'll move through quicker if it comes to that. I'm also going to ask you to feel free to stop me for clarifying questions, because I'm used to a class which is fundamentally interactive, right? As Dr. Wan knows, I am I'm big on cold calling, but I'm not going to do that here, right? So, but I am, used to interactive sessions. But again, time is very short. Okay. So with that, what is culture? What's corporate culture? How do we understand corporate culture? And what's interesting about corporate culture is that these are learned ways, as it says, of thinking and feeling and behaving. And what that means is you did not think or feel or behave this way before you joined this organization. And you only know that things are different. The culture, which is, of course, in the air, the culture, which is, of course, tacit, the culture, of course, which is not written down. It's tacit and it's emergent. It's not controllable completely, right, by top management. You only realize things are different when you do something that was completely normal in your prior setting. And when you do it here, it's like falling flat on your face. Then you say, okay, I get it. Right? Things are not the same. There's a culture here. Obviously, it's shared among the members of the group. And if you make a mistake, they won't point you to Rule 12.2c and say, you've done something wrong. Hopefully, They'll put their arms around your shoulder, metaphorically these days, right? And say to you, that's not the way we do things around here. Ah, okay, I get it. That's culture. Think of it as ways of viewing the world. So the world is a very complex place. It's incredibly complex. It's disturbingly complex. And culture helps us make sense of that very complex world. Right? It gives us a sense of reassurance, a sense of how to deal with this world, a template to deal with this world. And that's very much, by the way, a top management responsibility. So please tell us, how do we make sense of this? Say, somebody's cut price, right? Somebody's giving away some procedures for free. What does that mean for us? How does it change the way we should be doing things? And top management can help you make sense of that. And it's propagated through symbols and myths, such as if you go to 3M, which I'm sure you've been to, you can spend 15 minutes in 3M before they hold you with their glittering eye and they tell you a story. And the story is that Bill McKnight, who was the CEO of 3M, was walking past an R&D office when he sees a scientist, whose name is Drew, working with paper. And he says to him famously, "Stop working on paper. We are a mining company. You're wasting company resources." Famously, Drew ignores him. And that thing he was working on, that project he was working on, becomes masking tape and makes 3M's fortune. And ever since then, 3M has a culture that you are required almost to spend 15 to 20% of your time working on projects which are not corporate projects, which they still do. By the way, that's how Post-it notes got developed. Okay, so here's the thing about culture. What's really quite interesting. So people say, so I'm a strategy professor, right, at the U. And people say, culture eats strategy for breakfast. And there's some truth to that, except that culture is what was given birth to by strategy. In other words, culture is the resultant of what made us successful to start with. You see the problem, of course, because we keep doing what made us successful to start with, even when the environment around us has changed. Because culture is much harder to change. And the reason why it's hard to change is because of this uncertainty reducing value of culture. So we fall back on standard operating procedures and routines because these are what made us successful in the past as an organization. And that becomes our culture. And even when, as I said, the environment changes, you need to change your strategy. You are locked in because of the culture. Okay. So this we've kind of touched upon already. Of course, it's a form of social control. You can see how a culture, say, working, very hard might help the organization because there's a culture of working hard, right? You're putting more, giving more to the organization. Of course, it binds the organization, and most importantly, it both influences and limits how strategy can be changed. So culture, yes, eats strategy for breakfast, but the first strategy is where the culture came from. Okay. So very quickly, culture is a complex phenomenon because it's a three-level phenomenon. The first level is the visible level, the level of artifacts, the art on the wall, the furniture, the layout, which people can walk in and see. But this level of culture is only a reflection of a deeper level of culture, which is the level of norms and values, which can still be articulated. You can ask people, what are the norms and values in your organization? What do you believe is important? What norms and values do you live by? And they can still articulate that. However, even that is only a reflection of a third, still deeper level of culture, which is the level of basic assumptions. And these are assumptions like the nature of time. What does it mean to be late in your organization? When is a project report late? What's the long term in your organization? Those kinds of assumptions. And because those assumptions are so deeply held, they're so implicit, they're impossible to surface. And that's why cultural change is so very hard, because we're talking about going all the way down to the third level of basic assumptions. Okay. However, culture is not the same all the way through the organization. In fact, organizations have subcultures, as I mentioned. You might have a St. Paul unit, you might have a Minneapolis unit. Each of those units come with their subcultures, which are not the same. You cannot expect them to be the same at the start. Hopefully, you can try and create some commonalities between them, which is what we're going to get to. And then there are national cultures. We're not going to spend time on that, but I've written some papers on national culture, actually on national trust, and how trust is created differently in different countries. Excuse me. In the West, actually not so much the West, but in certain parts of the West, like in America, or in the UK, or in Germany, trust is created differently than in, say, Italy and Spain and the Far East. Okay. But we're not going to talk about that. Very quickly, we are all parts of members of different spheres of culture. Even in a health system like yours, you might have people who are radiologists, you might have people who are cardiologists, and they all have slightly different cultures, which are their professional cultures. So it's like an industry culture. So there is, of course, a corporate culture, but there's an industry culture. And then there's there's a professional and there's an industry. In your setting, it might be very similar. You can think of regional cultures. And so Minneapolis, excuse me, Minnesota has a regional culture, but even that is not the same. So for example, when General Mills bought Pillsbury, they had a huge culture clash because they were quite different in their cultures. Just a sec. So it turned out that one of them, I think it was Pillsbury, people were always on time. So their basic assumptions about time were very different, even though they were from the same regional culture. And then there are national cultures as well, all right? And even national cultures, we cannot expect them to be identical. So any one person may not embody a national culture. By the way, huge cultural differences between, say, Minnesota and Atlanta. So I had a friend who was from Northwest Airlines, and of course, Northwest was taken over by Delta. And he says, you cannot imagine how different things are in Delta, Atlanta. Okay, so with that, I'm just going to give you a quick sense of how do you change culture. So if you want to introduce a culture of collaboration based on trust if we want to foster a culture of collaboration based on trust, well, how do we go about doing it? What should we do? Well, one thing is actions by leaders are very important because they are watched. People are always looking to see what you're doing as a leader because they're looking to see if you really mean it. They're looking to catch you not doing things that are consistent with the new culture you're espousing. And they want to say, got you. So you've got to take symbolic actions that are consistent with the new culture. And as an example of a symbolic action, I did some work for Guidant. Of course, you all know Guidant, now Boston Scientific, makes defibrillators, right? Of course, you know what those are. And Guidant was worried that their innovativeness was flagging. So apparently they said to their employees, come to work this day wearing a tie you can afford to lose. I'm not sure what they did with the ladies. Maybe it was a scarf, right? Possibly. But as people walked in the door, they took a large pair of shears and cut the ties and threw them into the bonfire. And they said, we're not going to wear ties to work anymore because we want to create a culture that's much more egalitarian, much more open, much more free, and hopefully much more innovative. And you can bet that nobody will ever forget that symbolic action, right? So very important for top management to take symbolic actions to promote the people who represent the new culture and to not promote the people who represent the old culture. Obviously, reward systems very publicly reward the people who represent the actions that the new culture should be representing, in this case, collaboration, right? So the University of Minnesota, for example, had a grant program that was predicated on inter-unit collaboration. So I actually got a grant to work with the head of cardiology, who was the CEO of the, who was actually a nephrologist, sorry, but was the CEO of the health system, who happened to be my neighbor. And we worked on a paper. Actually, we worked on a paper. We got the data with the grant, but I'm still waiting for my RA, who's a professor now at the University of Virginia, to move the data forward. But what I'm saying is that the incentives to collaborate across units was built in, was enshrined in that grant process. And that's what got us to get the grant. Okay. All right, so very quickly, this is everything I've talked about, but the big story is the third bullet, which is the culture, sorry, and this doesn't go across up to this, just goes up to this point, but bullet point number 3, and the idea is that culture is embedded in the routines, in the systems, in the processes, and it's hard to change because nobody wants to change something that's so comforting, and they fall back on this thing that lowers their uncertainty. And they keep going back to it, is the point, even when the world around them changes. All right. So let's segue very quickly into trust research. I'm going to run through a few of my papers, my apologies, but just to show you some of the things I've done. And one of the big things which I'm going to refer to is inter-organizational trust. So how do you create trust across organizations, across organizational units? And as I said, I have a well-cited paper, which is that one. I've also done work on how do you create trust within the organization, of course, I'm going to draw upon that as well. My most recent work is on trust in online networks. So, how does one, in my world, I've got to adapt as well to the new environment. And the new environment, of course, is the online environment. So I take my research interests, I take my research capabilities, which are trust and networks, excuse me, and I apply them to the online setting. And so we have a very interesting paper just accepted in Management Science, which is one of our top journals. You have a question? No? Okay. Also cross-cultural, cross-national trust, and in different spheres in that cross-national space, just some of my papers as well. But here's the thing I wanted to point out. I even have a paper in Medical Care, which is a top journal, as you know. And that story, very interestingly, is a story of collaboration. And we are able to show that when surgeons, cardiologists, include PCPs in their networks, their outcomes, which is mortality from CABG procedures, is significantly lower. Right? So when you get a broader perspective, when you include people who have a different perspective, you're able to see things which you're not if you only talk to people who think just like you, is the point. Okay. All right, so now let's move on to talk about trust. So front and center. So what is trust? What does it mean to trust? And again, this is not trust in a family setting. It's trust in a business setting. It's trust in a professional setting. And what does it mean? So fundamentally, it means that you make yourself vulnerable. You can be hurt if people take actions that are not consistent with what you expect them to do. So vulnerability and risk is fundamental to trust. If you have no need to take a risk, you don't need to trust. So only when there's risk does trust, the question of trust, even arise. So trust involves risk and vulnerability, even if you cannot monitor them. So that's the key point. And of course, it happens at the individual level, i.e., individual to individual trust, professional colleagues trusting each other. I may be writing a paper with someone. I say, can you take the next crack and do the theory section or do the method section? And this colleague ditches me. Right? Colleague doesn't deliver, and our paper falls through the cracks. I've made myself vulnerable, and I've taken a risk, and I'm hurt, right? Because my trust has been violated. So that's the setting of individual to individual trust, a very much inter-firm trust, inter-organizational trust, and inter-unit trust. Right? So do we trust people from the College of Liberal Arts as a college? Do we trust people from, I'm sorry if this is too close to home, St. Paul? Right? Do people from St. Paul trust Minneapolis? How can we enhance the trust? So there's very much an inter-unit trust element as well, not just individual, but inter-unit trust as well. This is what I meant. And of course, it becomes even more critical when you cannot even see what people are doing, right? Because they're not face-to-face anymore. So lots of advantages of trust, and I've done some work. This is actually the same paper where we show that negotiation costs and conflict, negotiation costs are lowered, conflict is lowered with trust. So actually demonstrated it in inter-organizational, inter-unit settings. So you are able to negotiate come to solutions more easily, specifically in negotiating situations here, because it allows the people to throw up a wider range of alternatives. If I'm negotiating with someone I trust, I'm prepared to consider a much wider range of alternatives. What about that? And maybe we can think about that, because I am confident that the person will not stab me in the back, right? So that's the key. If I make an outlandish suggestion, they might say, maybe not that, or maybe something near that, but not quite that, rather than saying, you're absolutely nuts, and I'm not going to negotiate with you anymore. So that's trust. You're able to exchange information freely, and notice as well that in situations where information and knowledge is being transferred, right? Very much the situation in your setting. So you're transferring knowledge, you're having people, talk to you about, this is the new procedure we're considering, or here's something you might consider. There's a two-way trust requirement. So you need to trust the people to whom you're passing on the information. You need to trust the people who are the recipients of the knowledge, because if not, they might use that knowledge against you. So you need to trust those people, the recipients of the knowledge, but the recipients also need to trust the source of that knowledge. Are you telling us something which is really true? Are you sending us on a wild goose chase? Do you have our best interests at heart when you're telling us these things? So there's very much a trust requirement for the knowledge transfer situation, which is very much a part of what you folks do. Here's the other thing, which is really quite interesting. So I work on joint ventures as well, joint ventures, strategic alliances. And of course, because they are across organizational units, because they occur across companies, they need an agreement. They need a legal agreement to get started. But here's the thing. The moment they start, the agreement, the legal part, is locked in a drawer and never referred to again, except when it's time for termination. So it's only when you need to terminate the alliance do you pull out the legal agreement. Before that, the way it works is through what are known as implicit contracts. It's my word. I'll take your word for it. We can't write everything down. And there's a big idea in my field, in economics and sociology and management, which is the theory of the incomplete contract. You can never specify a complete contract, never, by definition. So contracts are always incomplete. And that's how people work. That's how contracts between organizations work. That's how contracts between organizations and people work. It's all based on implicit contracts. Okay. And of course, that means trust. Right? So the foundation of implicit contracts, the foundation of the working of implicit contracts has to be trust. Okay. This is what Arrow said. Trust is a lubricant. And as I said earlier, collaboration fundamentally involves trust. So if you want to change a culture, if you want to foster a culture of collaboration, you have to think about how to introduce trust into that culture, right? Because trust is foundational to collaboration. Okay. But here's the thing, as I said, you can be stabbed in the back because, of course, there's risk with trust. But here's the biggest idea. Well, all the ideas are big ideas, but here's a very big idea, which is that trust is not altruism. You're not giving things away for free out of the goodness of your heart in a professional setting. That's not trust. That's just being dumb. Right? Trust is what's known as enlightened self-interest. Enlightened self-interest, recognizing that if we work together, we can increase the size of the pie and we can both gain. So when I was, well, I've been lucky enough to be a full professor for 21 years. But even when I was a full professor and I gave talks at various schools, they would think that I might be in the job market, which wasn't. Obviously, my wife is there, so unless you give us both jobs, which they were prepared to do. But there'd always be an economist in the room who was typically the associate dean. And the economist would always think, what's this woolly, wishy-washy, fuzzy-wuzzy concept of trust? How do what the heck is this? It doesn't mean anything. We are hard-nosed empiricists, for example. We don't want to deal with this fuzzy-wuzzy, very unsatisfactory idea of trust. And I would say to them, because I have a background in economics, I would say to them, think of it as a longer time horizon. And that's just it. They say, oh, okay. It's just a longer time horizon. Because you don't want your reward here and now. You are prepared to wait. That's trust. Okay. I've lived in Italy, so speak Italian, love the opera, and there's an opera house in Milan. So I was in Milan visiting professor at Bocconi University. And it's very hard to get tickets for the opera because everyone in Italy, is corrupt. Right? So tickets are sold out before they're actually even available for sale. Right? 6 a.m. in the morning, we sit there with our fingers on the key, and we hit the thing, and it's sold out. So the only way you can get tickets to La Scala is from the scalper. And the scalper is on the steps, so La Scala means steps. Scalper's on the steps, and you recognize scalper because he's the man with the dog. Right? So that's how you recognize him. But when you give the scalper the money, you give the money with one hand and you take the tickets with the other hand. Right? So that's not trust, right? Because trust means you're prepared to wait. And when you don't trust, it's the here and the now. Okay, so it's enlightened, it's longer term. All right. So moving on, so very broad-based idea. I'm going to give you a little bit of a deep dive into trust, and we are, of course, oh dear, up against the clock, which I expected to be. So the first way of thinking about trust is that we each have different trusting propensities. We each come to the table with a different ability to trust. We are more prepared, if you like, to have a longer time horizon, or less prepared to have a longer time horizon. Right? So that's an individual propensity on the basis of cognition. And of course, if you like someone, you sometimes trust them as well. Very much an issue of interdependence. Can we see ourselves working together to get a larger pie? Can we collaborate to create a larger final outcome, a win-win? So very much an issue of interdependence, and of course incentives, which I'll talk about in a second. You can think of trust as well in terms of institutional supports. So very often that's the law system, the system of law and justice. To what extent do they support contracts? In many countries of the world, they don't work very well. In India, for example, it takes decades to resolve lawsuits. Right? So very hard to expect the legal system to back up your contracts, for example. So institutional support, it's very interesting. It's well known that different countries have different levels of trust. So America had a very high level of trust, but the well-known take on that is the level of trust is declining. The level of societal trust is declining. So a famous scientist, social scientist, Fukuyama, has made that observation. Okay. And then trust is developed on the basis of what your experience has been with that person or that subunit over time. Have you had a good experience? And typically, you take progressively larger risks. So you build up trust. You trust them a little at first, and then you trust them more. And when that works out, you trust them still more. So think of trust as well as different kinds. So we start with something called calculative trust, where you are very conscious of what's the risk you're taking, how much you might pay if trust is violated, and how much you might gain. And you make this gain versus loss, potential loss calculation, and you treat it very calculatively. But then there's goodwill trust, which is you're not really worried about calculativeness. You trust other people because they're benevolent. You trust other people because of their trusting propensity. You trust other people because of your trusting propensity as well. Institutional trust I've talked about. And there's also, in professional settings, a notion of trust as capability or competence. If you're really, really good at statistics, then I'm going to give you our method section of the paper. I trust that you'll be able to handle that. So notice there's an element of competence which may or may not feed into, say, goodwill. Right? Although there's some research, including some that I've done, which shows that goodwill feeds into competence, but not vice versa. Okay. And here's a way of thinking about how relationships evolve. And the point is, you start with some basic ways, supports of trust, and there's a great deal of reliance on calculativeness at the start of the relationship, right? That the amount of calculativeness is really high at the beginning. How much am I going to gain? How much am I going to lose? Is that calculation worth it? But over time, that gets lowered and goodwill trust increases in a relationship. Right? That's how it typically evolves. And then the question of trustworthiness. So the idea is we want to come across as trustworthy. We want to come across as people that can be trusted, as organizations that can be trusted. And research shows that these are the dimensions. So, of course, competence, I've just spoken about, and benevolence and integrity. So do you act with benevolence, integrity, and competence, and that enhances your trustworthiness. Notice that there's also a role for the truster's propensity. And those are moderators, right? You, of course, know what those are. So those arrows are enhancing the arrows of trustworthiness, leading to trust. So the more trustworthy you are, and the greater your trusting propensity, the more there is trust in that relationship, is the point. And this is work that I have done. Again, this is the 98 paper. And the idea is that inter-unit trust and inter-organizational trust, interpersonal trust go together. So there are two employees from subunit S, and these subunit S employees are trusting subunit M employees and trusting the subunit. So there's both inter-organization and interpersonal trust from the subunit S's employees. So you want the subunit S to trust subunit M. You've got to make subunit M trustworthy. So you have individuals again, so S1 and S2 are individuals from subunit S, which are prepared to trust the now trustworthy employees of subunit M and trust subunit M itself, right? And both those kinds of trust work together. All right, so how would you create trust? This is a 10-point program, right, based on research. And of course, I've talked about win-wins, what are our common goals, and demonstrate how achieving the common goals helps both of us. Right? There's a win-win for both sets of people. Related idea, how joint action creates value, interdependence, how that works, big story. I talked about the long term. So very famous book by a guy called Axelrod who talked about the evolution of cooperation. And essentially he says that if we have a long-term orientation, if we have a long-term horizon, we are much more likely to trust. And when the horizon gets shorter and shorter and shorter, you trust less and less and less, because now you can stab the other person in the back without fear of reprisal, because we are reaching the end of our relationship. So creating a longer term horizon enhances trust is the key idea. Research also shows that if you trust, then the other person is likely to trust you. So trust is a two-way street. Actually, it's a four-way thing, because it's my trust in the other person, my trustworthiness to the other person, and the other person's trust in me and their trustworthiness to me. Right? So there are four arrows in this relationship: trust and trustworthiness on either side. So how do you make yourself trustworthy? One way is to trust, because those arrows are connected. So make yourself vulnerable. And research shows, for example, that you can make unilateral commitments. Here, I'm putting myself out. Here, I'm trusting you with writing the method section of 5 of my papers. I'm really going to be hurt if you don't deliver. Won't you please come through and trust me in return? Right? So make unilateral commitments. Take a clearly visible leap of faith. As I said, talked about this already. Trustworthiness is a big part of it. And a big part of that is you deliver on your commitments. You deliver on your promises. You do what you say that you are going to do, what you said you were going to do. Take progressively bigger risks, as I said, over time, and so build up the degree of risk over time. That's how trust gets created. Obviously, those prior risks have to be borne out. You have to be able to demonstrate, both of you, that those risks were worth taking, is the key idea. And find ways to work together. And very importantly, as an organization, just like I said about the University of Minnesota, saying that we want to encourage cross-disciplinary research. So when we get grant proposals that involve people from different disciplines, we are more likely to support them. So that kind of incentive for collaboration would be important at the level of the organization, at the level of the leadership of the organization. Okay. So almost at the end of my time here, actually at the end of my time, going over a little bit. But these are, fairly obvious kinds of things you might consider doing. Find ways to work together, find ways to create a strategy. What's our vision? What's our mission? How are we going to do things differently? And do that together. So create a common vision would be the idea, and do it together in terms of strategy as well. Have ways of working together, encourage ways of working together, have people in teams, set up incentives to work together. And then, of course, out of the work context, you can have people, doing ice fishing together. And lots of other things like this. Okay, this is just a fun fact about how trust is created differently in different settings. And here's a paper that I've done, which is an easy read on national trust. So with that, let me open it up to questions. Yes?
Thank you for that great talk, Professor Zaheer. I really enjoyed it. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit. Oh, I think the room is mic'd.
I know, but it's easier.
Okay. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about fostering trust and collaboration amidst competing priorities.
Yeah. No, of course, we are all always competing and collaborating at the same time. I mean, that's really just a fact of life. And any strategic alliance that, I study alliances, they are inherently both cooperative and competitive at the same time. So you have to emphasize the cooperation part. You have to provide incentives for the cooperation part, recognizing that there will also be competition in the process. And you hope that, collaboration will get enhanced while you're competing. So that's just, life, if you like. Right? Those are trade-offs. It's a tough trade-off, but it's a very common trade-off.
Thank you, Dr. Zaheer. I think you're perhaps the first stage actor that's given us a grant. That's very good. I appreciate your time. I wonder if you could give us a couple of examples in the real world of a company or organization that have done it well, and perhaps done it not so well.
Great point. So I'm going to talk about strategic alliances, which is fundamentally about collaboration. So one of the most successful collaborations, strategic alliances, is that between GE aircraft engines and a French company called Snecma. And they make the CFM engine, which, by the way, powers the 737 and the Airbus A320 or A321. And so it's lasted for 30 years and been hugely successful. And you would wonder how a French and an American team could work together so successfully for so long. And the way they do it is they focus, to your point, they say to each other, this is where we are collaborating. This area is not where we are collaborating. Please do not try and learn what we do here. Because, by the way, GE makes another engine which is not part of the relationship. Right? And paradoxically, that enhances trust even more. So we are collaborating here. Here's where we will share everything. But this is our personal space. And please don't try and find out what's going on here. So that's an example where things don't work, where things work. Where things don't work is, of course, so trust can be destroyed in a second. That's the other thing about trust. It takes forever to build. That can be destroyed in a second. So I've got papers on trust violations as well. And we show, very interestingly, that when trust is violated, the hurt, the feeling of being violated is much greater with the people who you trusted than with the people you didn't trust. Or with the people. So notice you start off relationships with a baseline of some level of trust. But notice if trust is violated, it drops below that baseline. So it's even worse than somebody you're starting out with, because now you cannot trust them. So there's a baseline, there's a negative, and then there's a positive. And it drops from the positive very deep, much lower than starting out with someone when trust is violated. So we show that as well. It's like, and we call it et tu, Brute. I trusted you. You stabbed me in the back. Et tu, Brute. Yes. Yeah.
John?
Yes, we have one virtual question thus far, and the question is, you had talked about when trust is broken, so I think this will transition nicely into that. But what are some strategies for regaining trust if that trust
I have
is
a
broken?
paper on that. Sorry, but I do. So the question is, is it very important idea? Is it seen as a competence violation or an integrity violation? Very important idea. Is the breach of trust very clearly a competence violation or an integrity violation? And integrity violations are much harder to forgive. Competence violations, maybe you haven't been trained properly. Maybe we can work on that. Maybe we can, remake our relationship, because after the training, maybe your competence will come up to scratch. But integrity, how do you train people on integrity? So much harder to forgive.
Thank you very much.
It's a pleasure.